heroin is a drug. And boy, let me tell you, is it pleasant? Would you like some? What if I was a scientist and I came to you and I made the following offer? I can transform you into a snail. What would you say? Would you say you'd like to be transformed into a snail? Maybe not. But let me add something. Listen, you're going to have an excellent snail life. I guarantee that if you sign up for this program, you're going to get a really nice terrarium with all sorts of cool snail stuff that snails love to do. There's going to be really good dirt in there and other things that snails really like, and toys for you, the snail, to play with. And there's going to be other snails, very attractive other snails. And you guys can get together and do your snail stuff. And I can guarantee that you're going to be a very popular snail because I'm going to transform you into a very good-looking snail who's also very socially adept and that sort of thing. So you're going to get along great with all the other snails. You're going to have all your snail needs taken care of. Also, let me just point out, there will be no traffic on your commute to work because there will be no work. You won't have to pay taxes. You won't have to shovel the driveway or anything like that. It's going to be pretty good. Would you like to be a snail? Presumably, the answer is no. Like if you were really, it's a fun example to start a video with or whatever, but if you were actually given this offer, if it was a sincere offer and it could actually be done, what would you really say? I take it that you would really say no. You wouldn't want to become a snail. And I take it also that you would think that if anyone else said yes, they would be doing something irrational. They would be making a kind of mistake if they wanted to be a snail. That's not the kind of thing that they really want or that's really in their best interest. Okay, does this pose a problem for one of the theories that we were talking about last time, in particularly for hedonism? So you'll remember, right, that we're talking about this sort of bigger, grander moral view called utilitarianism, right? And I was claiming that utilitarianism can sort of be broken down into three subtheses. There's hedonism, right? There's aggregation, and then there's consequentialism, right? And hedonism was the first of the three. And it seems like what we read for today, which was a short snippet, a little example called The Experience Machine by Robert Nozick. It seems that this example is a kind of problem for hedonism. Okay, so before we get on to the details of what the experience machine is, how this machine that we're imagining is supposed to work and how it's supposed to be relevant to hedonism, let's keep talking about snails for a minute. Is the fact that you wouldn't want to be transformed into a snail, is that a problem for hedonism? Right. So hedonism, as you remember, is the theory that what is good for each of us as an end is pleasure, and what is bad for each of us as an end is pain. Well, it seems like if you would refuse to be transformed into a snail, who would get a lot of pleasure, right? And very little pain. You would have excellent snail health care, and you wouldn't have to deal with bureaucracy or whatever. You'd experience very little pain, and you'd experience an enormous amount of pleasure. It seems like the fact that you would refuse to be transformed into a snail, and the fact that you would be rational, you'd be right in thinking that it's not in your own best interest to be transformed into a snail, well, that seems to show that hedonism is false. Maybe it shows, or it seems to show, that there's something that matters other than pleasure. Oh, but the hedonist can reply to this example and say, no, hedonism is still true, but I, the hedonist, I'll grant that it doesn't make sense, or it's not rational, or it's not in your own real best interest to be transformed into a snail, because snails aren't capable of experiencing the same amount of pleasure that a human is capable of. Not as much pleasure, right? That's how the hedonist can respond. The hedonist can say, yes, yes, yes. It's not in your best interest to be transformed into a snail, but that's not because there's something other than pleasure that's good for people as an end, but it's because snails don't get that much pleasure. They get a little bit of pleasure from, hanging out in the dirt and from getting it on with other snails, but they don't have nearly as much pleasure as a human being can have when a human being listens to a sonata or whatever, or gets together with an old friend and laughs and has a long meal and loses track of time or whatever and feels like they're young again or something. Snails can't have that. So humans can have way more pleasure, and that's why it's rational not to be transformed into a snail, even though hedonism is still true. Okay, so we had a potential problem for the hedonist, and then we had a hedonist response to that problem. Well, we could develop a new problem, right? Here's a new offer. I'm not going to transform you into a snail. I'm instead going to offer you something else very enticing. If you'd like it, it's something called heroin. Heroin is a drug, and boy, let me tell you, is it pleasant? Would you like some? Well, you might say no, because even though the pleasure that I'm going to get from heroin will be significant in the short term, in the long term, it's going to ruin my life and it's going to destroy all of my relationships or whatever. And then I say, oh, whoa, 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 whoa. Well, wait a minute. Let me tell you about something I've just created. It's called super heroin. Well, here's the thing. Super heroin has all of the advantages of heroin, right? It's extremely pleasant to take it, except for it doesn't have any of the side effects. It won't destroy your relationships or anything like that. And when you're plugged into the super heroin drip, we're going to make sure that you don't have any problems. You're not going to get an infection at the injection site or whatever. It's going to be really great, and there's no side effects to super heroin. Would you take the super heroin? What if I gave it to you for free? Free super heroin. Do you want it? And there's an unlimited supply, of course. You're never going to run out. You could just keep taking super heroin for your entire life. Does the fact that you would say no, or maybe some of you would say no, or you think it would be rational to say no, does that fact show that hedonism is false, that pleasure isn't the only thing that's good for an individual person? Maybe. But maybe you still think, look, the kinds of pleasure that you can get as a snail, and similarly, the kinds of pleasure that you can get from heroin, even if it's super heroin and it doesn't have the side effects, those kinds of pleasure don't reach the levels of the kinds of pleasure that you get in your ordinary life when you get together with an old friend for a meal, or see your child graduate from college, or listen to a sonata, or whatever. You get more pleasure from those things. And that, the hedonist might say, is why it would be rational to say no to super heroin and to say no to becoming a snail. Well, here's what's going on. The hedonist can always reply to these types of objections by saying that in your ordinary life, you get more pleasure from ordinary things than you do from what seems like a pure pleasure-giving, experience. Well, that's the point of the experience machine thought example. It's an example where we're just going to recreate all of the stuff that supposedly gives you pleasure according to the hedonist. Nonetheless, we're going to see that it doesn't seem like it's in your best interest to plug in to that machine. Let's read what Nozick says in describing the machine. Here's what Nozick says. Suppose there were an experience machine that would give you any experience that you desired. Super duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or reading an interesting book. All the time, you would be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Suppose that you were given this offer, Nozick says. Would you sign up? Would you plug in? If you wouldn't sign up to have whatever experience would give you the most pleasure possible and the least amount of pain, if you wouldn't sign up for this, then, Nozick thinks, it must be that there's something that matters to you, and we might think that should matter to you, that you're rational in thinking it matters to you. There's something that matters to you other than what mere experience can provide, because the experience can provide you with all the pleasure you could ever want, right? Even if you think that snails don't get enough pleasure, or heroin addicts don't get enough pleasure, if you think that the right kind of pleasure comes from writing a great novel, the feeling that you get from trying to figure out how to piece together the plot or whatever, and then getting it and writing the words out, finding the exact right phrasing for the dialogue of your characters or whatever. If you think that that's the thing that gives a person, maybe you in particular or people in general, the most pleasure, well then actually, strictly speaking, it's not the writing of the novel that gives you the pleasure. It's the experience of writing the novel that gives you the pleasure. If you were plugged into this machine and you thought you were writing a novel, but you weren't, it was all pre-programmed, you would still get all of the same amount of pleasure as you would if you were actually writing the novel. So why is it that you would say no? Presumably you would. That's the thought. That's what Nozick thinks, right? You would say no because there's something other than pleasure that you think is good for you as an end. And you'd be right. Nozick suggests that there are three things that this initial example of the experience machine shows are important to people. Three things that, well, are good for each of us as an end, other than pleasure. And here are the three. These are the three things that he thinks this example shows might be important other than pleasure, or might be good for each of us as an end. The first one is actually doing things. If you're in the experience machine, then you're not writing a novel. You are just floating in a vat with electrodes attached to your brain. You're not writing anything. You're just having the experience as if you were writing something. And he thinks that we want, and we're rational to want, we want to do things, to actually write novels, to actually make friends, to actually read interesting books. We want to do things, and we want to have the results of our labor be real results that result from what we really do. The other thing is that we actually want to be a certain way. We don't, like, if you have the experience of being a supportive friend, and that gives you pleasure, like your friend comes to you with a problem and maybe you don't even have the solution to their problem, but you support them and you hear them out, right? And you let them know, and then you actually follow through that you're there for them or whatever. You're a supportive friend if you actually do that stuff. If you're just plugged into the experience machine, then you're not actually a supportive friend. You're not anyone's friend. You're just floating in a vat. And it might be that we actually want to be a certain way. We don't just want to experience being that way. And then finally, it seems that we want to make actual contact with reality. We don't want it to just seem to us as if we are interacting with the world. We want to really interact with the real world around us. So we might wonder whether any of these all by themselves are enough to explain what's good for an individual person as an end, in addition to pleasure, maybe, right? And Nozick considers some modifications of the experience machine example. First, he imagines what he calls a transformation machine. The transformation machine is just like the experience machine, where you experience having a life, except for it also transforms you. That is, it changes you. If in your illusory, dreamed, pre-programmed experience, you have the experience of building muscle so that you can lift 1,000 pounds or something like that. Well, the transformation machine will give you the experience of going to the gym all of those times, but then it will also transform your muscles. It will make you strong enough. So actually, in a certain sense, it will make you the way that you want to be. It will make you strong, for example. Or maybe it makes you into a supportive person who supports people, right? It modifies your brain so that not only you have experiences, but also so that you're caring. And that if you were to be unplugged from the machine, and you were to interact with someone who is your friend, you would be supportive of them because your brain has been transformed by the transformation machine. Would you get in then? Would you accept the offer to go into the experience machine, or rather in this case, the transformation machine? Nozick thinks you would still say no, and you'd be right to still say no. And what that shows is that there's something we care about and should care about more than, and in addition to, just pleasure plus being a certain way. And then he imagines another type of machine. I think he calls it the results machine. It's a version of the experience machine where if the experience machine gives you the experience of, say, helping someone else, then the results machine actually goes and makes the results happen. That is, it goes and finds the person or a relevant person and it helps them. You're trapped in the machine, of course, so you didn't help anyone, but the results still come about. What this shows, if you would still refuse to get into this machine and you'd still be rational to, it shows that there's more to what's good for a person or what people really want. There's more than just pleasure. There's more than just being a certain way or becoming a certain way. And there's more than just, well, the world changing as a result of your experience. So what is it that's left? What is left after all of these examples as some additional thing that this kind of machine could never provide, but that we seem to think is good for an individual person? Well, here's what Nozick says. Nozick says, perhaps what we desire is to live, an active verb, ourselves, to live ourselves in contact with reality. And this, machines cannot do for us. The idea is that a machine can give you experiences of things that aren't really happening. A machine can transform you. A machine can transform the world. But a machine can't live your life for you. It seems from the fact that we don't want to go into these machines, it seems that there's something very, very important to us, and that thing is actually living our own lives in contact with the real reality. That seems to be very important to us, so important that we would give up all of this pleasure, and all of this transformation and all of these results. We would give up all of that because even though those things might matter to us, they might be good for us, there's something else that we think is good for us. And that's living our own lives in contact with the real world. If Nozick is right about what we would do in response to these machines and what we would be rational in doing in response to these machines, well then, hedonism is false. That's what this is meant to show. This is an attack on hedonism. Let me say a couple things. One is, hedonism was and is a very attractive view for several reasons. For one thing, it's attractive because it's maybe easier to measure pleasure and pain than it is to measure these other things, like living your own life in contact with the world. How do you measure that? One thing is that it seems to be measurable. Another thing is that hedonism is kind of democratic, or at least the version of hedonism from Bentham that we were discussing last time, right? Everyone's pleasures count equally, no matter how fancy those pleasures are or how simple. There's certain attractive things about hedonism. The other attractive thing, of course, is that pleasure really and truly is good as an end. It is true that pleasure is good for people and pain is bad for them. And so hedonism is attractive in all of these ways, but the thought is, hedonism claims that pleasure is the only good thing. And the experience machine example is meant to show that it's not the only good thing. I'll also just clarify that hedonism is not a moral theory. We said this last time and I want to say it again. Hedonism is not a theory about what anyone ought to do, morally speaking. It's just a theory about what's good for people, sort of selfishly, what's good for a person. And so the decision that someone is making when they're deciding whether to go into the experience machine or not is fundamentally a decision about what's in your own best interest. Is it good for you to go into the machine? And the thought is no. So what that shows is something about hedonism. It shows that this, which is a theory about what's good for a person individually, well, is it just pleasure? Okay, now I just want to end by dealing with a common misunderstanding that some students take away from reading this example, right? When students sometimes are summarizing what the experience machine example is meant to show, is they say something like this. They say, the example shows that there's a certain kind of pleasure that you can't get from a machine, but that you can only get from living your life. No, that's not what this example is meant to show. It's not meant to show that there's some kind of pleasure that the experience machine doesn't get you. Indeed, the whole point of the experience machine is that it gives you all the pleasure. You get the pleasure that you would get from appearing or thinking that you're making actual contact with reality, because the machine makes you think that you're making actual contact with reality. So you get all of the pleasure. The experience machine example instead shows that there's something other than pleasure that seems to matter to us. And if we're right about what matters to us, then the experience machine example shows that there's something that's good for us other than pleasure.